webinar room. Before we start the session, I would just like to go through several housekeeping rules for this online session. So we kindly ask for all audience to keep your camera on throughout the session if you are able to. We also request for all participants to kindly mute your microphone throughout the session. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the talk. So we will invite questions from all audience. So if you have any questions for the speaker, please raise your hand and open your microphone. Or you can also pop in the question via the chat box function in the Zoom platform. May we also ask all audience to use the virtual background provided by the organizing committee. A copy of the file will also be shared in the chat box. And lastly, also in the chat box, we will share an attendance form that you can fill out soon after the discussion session. So please make sure to complete the form before this online session ends. And we will start this session in a couple of minutes. So ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon for all audience in Indonesia and good morning to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Witt in South Africa. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to our expert talk, which will be held for the next couple of hours today on Thursday, 28 November 2024. My name is Radisti and I will be the MC of this online session. This event is organized by the Research Center for Ecology and Ethnobiology, the National Research and Innovation Agency, or BRIN, in Indonesia. And today we host a very interesting topic on cross-cutting impacts of invasive alien species via a multi-sectoral management approach. And in this occasion, we are honored to welcome Dr. Asep Hidayat as the head of Research Center for Ecology and Ethnobiology at BRIN, our honorable speaker, Dr. Arne Witt, as the International Coordinator for Invasive Alien Species at KABI, our moderator for today's session, who will chair the talk, Dr. Titik Setiawati, a senior researcher at the Center for Ecology and Ethnobiology at BRIN, and of course, all participants who have attended this expert talk. Ladies and gentlemen, Bapak Ibu sekalian, before we start the session, please allow me to go through our agenda for today. So soon after this opening, we will start the session with a welcoming remark from the head of Research Center for Ecology and Ethnobiology, after which I will hand over the session to our moderator, Dr. Titik Setiawati, who will chair the presentation session from our guest speaker. And this will be followed immediately with a question, answer, and discussion session. So there will be a photo session in between the presentation and discussion session. So may we invite all participants to open your camera during this photo session. And lastly, it will be a closing session. So ladies and gentlemen, Bapak Ibu sekalian, we will now start the event with a welcoming remarks from the head of Research Center for Ecology and Ethnobiology, Bapak Dr. Asep Hidayat. To Bapak Asep, the time and screen are yours.
Ya, thank you Ibu Radisti. Selamat siang Bapak Ibu semua. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. And good afternoon in Indonesian time. Maybe good morning in the South Africa ya, Mr. Anne and respective participant, college and distinguished guests. First of all, I would like to thank to you from the jamming session committee, Ibu Jega and the team from the arrangement of the jamming session today. I would like to thank also to Mr. Anewit for his willingness to attend and to be a speaker in the today jamming session event. And of course, I would like also say thank you to Ibu Titi and Ibu Radisti for their willingness to be MC and moderator from this event. The topic of today expert talk is related to the cross-cutting impact of the invasive alien species via a multi-sector management approach. Is present with the great pride. Yeah, we are honorable to have Dr. Anne Witz, a famous authority in this area, who will share his knowledge in a crucial subject. As we know that invasive alien species provide problem in the variety of the industry. That impact are extensive, influence the human health, economy, and ecosystem in the various fields. In order to provide a comprehensive and long-lasting solution, it is imperative that invasive alien species management be approached from the multi-sector, holistic perspective to the integrated knowledge from several domain. With his background in the environmental science and policy, and his in-depth knowledge of the multi-sector management, Dr. Witz has a comprehensive analysis of the cross-cutting impact of the invasive alien species to create solution required to overcome this obstacle. I invite all participants to ask questions and make the most of the chance to gain knowledge from one of the top authority in this area. Let's enjoy to the jamming session, and hopefully it will be useful from all of us. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Radisti. Time yours.
Thank you, Bapak Asep, for the remark. Ladies and gentlemen, Bapak Ibu sekalian, without further ado, we will begin the presentation session from our distinguished expert, Dr. Arne Witt from KB. And to introduce our expert today, Dr. Witt is the International Coordinator for Invasive Alien Species at KB in Nairobi, Kenya. He has been undertaking research and implementing projects on invasive alien species management for over 30 years, focusing on invasive plants and their control. And most of Dr. Witt's work has been undertaken in low and middle income countries to develop tools and assist in identifying invasive plants, but in some cases also alien animals. Dr. Witt has also been involved in developing various strategies and plans, including national invasive species strategies and action plans, prevention mechanism, and early detection and rapid response systems. In addition, Dr. Witt has also served as an international project coordinator and technical advisor for several regional and national UNEP-GEF invasive alien species projects in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Middle East. Dr. Witt has a PhD from the University of the Witwatersrand, South Africa, and Masters of Science degrees in entomology and conservation biology. Dr. Witt has also authored and co-authored numerous journal articles, book chapters, and books on the identification and management of invasive alien species, which includes field guides on naturalized and invasive plants of Eastern Africa, Kenya, Southeast Asia, Yemen, Malawi, and the Caribbean. The presentation from our speaker will be chaired by our very own Dr. Titik Setiawati, who is a senior researcher from Ecology and Ethnobiology Research Center at BRIN. Dr. Titik is an expert in wildlife management and biodiversity conservation. For almost 40 years, he has served as scientist, technical professional, project coordinator for a number of collaborative works involving Indonesian and international bodies, mainly to inform policies on biodiversity conservation and the management of invasive alien species in Indonesia. Dr. Titik, I will now hand over the session to you. The time and screen are yours.
Thank you, Radisti. Thank you very, very much for the nice introduction anyway. Very good afternoon, Arnie, and then also everyone joining this webinar. Happy to see you, and then hope that everything going well, Arnie in Africa. First, I would like to thank Arnie here that his available time, because I know exactly that Arnie is very, very busy, quite busy at the moment. And then we would like to ask you to share your experience on how to manage invasive alien species in various countries around the world. And we knew actually, some of us, we are in the same project. Arnie is an international expert and in the field of IAS. And then he's been involved in our project in Indonesia. We call it Removing Barriers for Invasive Alien Species Management in Southeast Asia, which is actually involves 4 countries. It was funded by Jeff, and then it was last for about 4 or 5 years since 2012. And then for everyone, I would like to announce that Arnie is actually, if we can check his scopus, probably is very high. And in Indonesia, you know exactly, Arnie, that we are still working to meet the target of KMBGF, BGF. It's a Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Global Framework, with regard to invasive alien species. So we have to curb or reduce the rate of invasive alien species entering the Indonesian territory. In the meanwhile, we also aware that it is actually not easy to slow down this rate without strong regulation and law enforcement. You know very well, since we run the project a long time back. And then still the issue is the cross-sector issue, which is sometimes overlooked, the threat of IAS. So this is going to be our topic today for everyone. And then we will have an opportunity. This is a good opportunity to hear from Arnie, who's joining us from another part of the world. And then Arnie, after 30 minutes presentation, not 30 minutes, we give you 1 hour presentation, and we will allocate 1 hour for question and answer session for you. So I think I will hand it over the times and screen is yours now, Arnie. Arnie, are you there?
Yes, I'm. Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
you
first,
can start.
yeah, thank you very much, Tik, for the introduction and everyone else's introductions. Welcome, everyone. I see there are many people. There are 57 people now. I hope that everyone can hear me. I'm going to try and talk as slowly as I possibly can. I tend to rush through my talks, but I'll tell myself all the time to slow down. If there's anything unclear, I'm sure anyone can interrupt and ask for some clarity. I don't think that's a problem. That's if the MC will oblige participants to ask questions if they would like to. But let me get started. So I'm assuming that everyone can see my presentation.
Yes,
Is that
it's
correct?
clear. Yes, that's correct. Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
that's clear.
And if you can't hear me, please send a message or give a shout or something, because the connectivity might not be that good. So as was mentioned, I'm largely going to talk about the cross-cutting impacts of invasive alien species. It's a massive field. As you know, invasive alien species occur in every taxonomic group known to us, from bacteria right to mammals, including plants, for example, and algae, etc. So they really occur almost everywhere, in every corner of the planet now, even in Antarctic and the Arctic. There are a number of invasive species that are very established and proliferating. Because I mainly work in Africa, obviously the talk is going to mainly focus on Africa. But we must remember that the impacts of invasive species are generic, in the sense that the impact of an invasive plant like Chromalina in Africa would be very similar to the impact that it's having in Indonesia. So the impacts are not unique to a specific country or region. So we all know, or most of us know, that the biggest threats to biodiversity are climate change, overexploitation, pollution, habitat loss, and invasive alien species. And it's in no particular order. I think this is very important to recognize. It's not as if invasive alien species are less or more important than climate change or overexploitation. They all have an equal impact. And if we want to conserve biodiversity, then we have to address all of those issues. We cannot just address one of them in the hope that we are going to achieve protection of our natural environment. The important thing to recognize, and has been said by some of the introductory remarks, is that invasive alien species have cross-cutting impacts. So they don't just impact on biodiversity. And I know that the CBD, the Convention of Biological Diversity, generally just refers to invasive alien species that have had impacts on biodiversity, but they don't. They have a much wider impact. So they have an impact on crop and livestock production, human and animal health, fires. I'm sure many of you are aware of the fires that we recently had in Hawaii, where close to 100 people died. Those were largely driven by introduced alien grasses from Africa. A lot of the fires we had 2 or 3 years ago in Spain were driven by Australian eucalyptus species. A lot of the fires being driven in Chile are as a result of introduced pine species, etc. So fires, invasive alien species, and climate change are largely driving fires around the world. Invasive woody weeds like Australian acacias, mesquite or prosopis, also has a massive impact on water resources, especially if they're growing up in water catchments. So, for example, in South Africa, we estimate that invasive alien plant species are not managed. We will lose 56% of our water runoff. So, and overall, they have a massive impact on economic development. And unless they're managed, we are really going to count the costs in very many ways, from human health to biodiversity loss. So we already know introduced plants, especially crop weeds and crop pests, pose the biggest threat to crop production at a global level, together with environmental degradation and climate change. And these are just some quotes from some articles or some newspaper articles or some journal publications. And you can see some estimates suggest crop losses average as high as 40% at a global cost of $220 billion annually. So these include weeds and introduced insects, mites, pathogens, etc. And they also have a massive impact on livestock production, either directly or indirectly. So, for example, directly on the introduction of various diseases, which impact on livestock, also impacting on introduction of invasive plants, obviously also impact on pasture production in terms of the amount of forage available within a landscape. So you can see there the one journal found that 71% of natural grazing in South Africa will be lost if invasive alien plant species are not managed. And I think this would apply to most countries in the world, where if invasive alien plants, which are generally unpalatable, not managed, we will lose most of our natural grazing. This is just one example of a tick, Amblyomma variegatum, which was accidentally introduced with livestock into the Caribbean, and is having a massive impact on livestock production. And this is just an image of a cow, which is totally covered in ticks, as you can see here. And these ticks are responsible for the transmission of various diseases, which have a negative impact on livestock production. And the interesting thing is that the cattle egret, which is a bird which was introduced to the Caribbean, is actually responsible for the spread of this tick. So it moves larvae and nymphs across the Caribbean. So when it flies from one area, one island to the next, it carries the larvae and nymphs of this tick with it. And so often they eradicate the tick, but then it's reintroduced by the cattle egret, which is a vector of the tick itself. We spoke about livestock health. So rinderpest was a disease that was accidentally introduced into Africa from Asia. So the imported livestock from Asia, which had the disease rinderpest. And rinderpest then spread to cattle belonging to local inhabitants, but it also has an impact on antelope and buffalo species. So it has a massive impact on biodiversity. So all these cattle here and this picture was taken in South Africa. You can see all these cows died from rinderpest. Obviously, people who were dependent on livestock had a big impact on their livelihood. And a third of the human population of Ethiopia perished after the introduction of rinderpest and the loss of livestock. And it also had a massive impact on the Maasai in East Africa. The good thing about this is rinderpest, the disease itself, has now been eradicated from the world, so it's no longer a problem. But it just demonstrates once again what can happen when livestock diseases are moved from one part of the world to another. Invasive alien species also pose a significant threat to human health. This is why we keep on saying it's not just a biodiversity issue, it's not just an agricultural issue, but it's also a human health issue. And you can see that first quote there from Hume from 2014. It has been hypothesized that invasive alien species may have a disproportionate impact on the transmission of zoonotic pathogens. Now, obviously, with COVID, I'm sure all of you remember COVID, how it rapidly moved across the world and how we tried to stop the movement or transmission or movement, at least, of infected people across the globe to try and contain the spread of this disease. And it is postulated that zoonotic diseases are more prone or more likely, or outbreaks are more likely to happen as a result of movement of diseases from animals to people, and especially from invasive alien species to people. And we already know the impacts of some introduced mosquito species to different parts of the world, where they've been responsible for the spread of a whole host of diseases, including dengue, chikungunya, Zika, and yellow fever. I just briefly want to mention Black Death or bubonic plague. Some of you may have heard of this before. There was an outbreak in Europe of bubonic plague, or what they call Black Death, in the 14th century. And many people have tried to postulate how it actually arrived, or what caused bubonic plague. Apparently, there were rats that were introduced from Asia. So the black rat, Rattus rattus, was accidentally introduced into Europe on ships from Asia. And those rats were carrying with them a flea. And that flea was carrying a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. And this is fatal. So the rats were now abundant and widespread and invasive in Europe. They were carrying fleas, and the fleas were carrying this disease. And these fleas were biting people, and in doing so, they infected people. And it is thought that over 200 million people died as a result of Black Death in Europe. So some people say less, some people say only 25 million people. Other reports will say 200 million people. But nevertheless, it's a lot of people died as a result of the introduction of invasive alien bacterium, which was carried on invasive alien rats. So here again is a good example of where an invasive alien species has had negative impact on human health. And I just want to talk a bit about some of the introduced pests, just briefly, some of the worst ones. So this is the cabbage diamondback moth, which has also been introduced to Indonesia, which is also present in Indonesia. I'm not going to go into detail in terms of its impact, but if it's not controlled, you can lose 100% of your crop, especially of cabbage. So it mainly feeds on cabbage, but it also feeds on other cruciferous vegetables like broccoli and cauliflower and oilseed crops. But the impacts are quite severe, and this pest is now also present in Indonesia and obviously having a massive impact on crop production. What this means is that more and more farmers now have to use pesticides, and pesticides obviously have a negative impact on agrobiodiversity. And we know now that the use of pesticides has the biggest impact on our agrobiodiversity. So the introduction of a pest which has a significant impact on crop yields results in the introduction or the use of pesticides, which in itself has a negative impact on biodiversity. This is the golden apple snail, which is now also present in Indonesia. I'm not sure how it was introduced. Some people say it was introduced as a pet into Indonesia. I'm not sure, but it's a nice big snail. So maybe some people like to keep them as pets. I don't know. But in many other countries, it was introduced as a food source, and it now has a massive impact on not only crop production, but can also have an impact on human health. Then there's a good example here of where biocontrol has gone wrong. So what happened was that in countries, especially on some of the islands around the world, where the snail had been introduced, they decided to introduce this snail, which is a predatory snail. So this snail actually feeds on other snails, attacks and feeds on other snails, to try and reduce its abundance, the abundance of species like the golden apple snail or the giant African snail. The sad thing is, which was unbeknown or they didn't test sufficiently, is that this snail actually also feeds on indigenous snail species. So it doesn't actually only feed on the target species, the introduced pest species, but also feeds on indigenous snail species. And you can see there what impact it's had on indigenous snail species on many islands around the world. And they estimate that 134 snail species have been driven to extinction through the introduction of this snail species. Then invasive mammals. We know that invasive mammals have had the biggest impact on island ecosystems. So islands around the world have been badly affected by the introduction of introduced rodents, cats, dogs, goats, donkeys, etc. And they've had the biggest negative impact on biodiversity on these islands. And we know Indonesia consists of about 17,000 islands. So I would imagine that many invasive or introduced mammals have had a significant impact on diversity on these island ecosystems. So you can see the invasive rats and mice have been linked to the extinction or the local extinction of 75 vertebrate species. That's 52 birds, 21 mammals, and 2 reptile species. Cats, many people keep cats as pets, and there are many feral cat populations around the world, and they've been linked to the extinction of 63 vertebrate species. And then the other introduced vertebrates like red foxes, dogs, pigs, small Indian mongoose. Small Indian mongoose was introduced as a biocontrol agent, but it's a generalist and has had huge impacts on biodiversity. So invasive mammals are probably having a significant impact on biodiversity on many of your islands in Indonesia. So now I'm going to talk a bit about plants, a bit more detailed on plants. So some of the worst invasive alien plant species, so that's what IAPS stands for, invasive alien plant species in Southeast Asia. So as Tik mentioned, I've done some surveys, some work in Southeast Asia, and You're being inundated with invasive alien plant species. In fact, you're drowning almost in invasive alien plant species. They're becoming more and more abundant every day, every hour, every second as we speak. And they are starting to dominate many of your landscapes. So these are some of the species, some of the worst invasive alien plant species in Southeast Asia. There are many, many more, but you may be familiar with some of these. This here is Chromalina odorata, which is probably one of the worst weeds in Indonesia. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. This picture was taken in Tanzania. So you can see here, all the yellow you see here, all this yellow here is all Chromalina. So this whole landscape is dominated by Chromalina odorata. And I think there are many similar landscapes, probably also in Indonesia, where Chromalina odorata dominates. If you look at the understory, if you look at underneath a stand of Chromalina odorata, this is what you see. There's absolutely nothing or virtually nothing growing underneath the stand of Chromalina. So it shades out all the other growth. The problem with Chromalina is also unpalatable. Livestock don't eat it. So cattle and sheep won't eat Chromalina, for example. So studies done in South Africa, they said it reduces livestock carrying capacities from 6 hectares per livestock unit, large livestock unit, to 15 hectares. So maybe previously you had a big farm, 6 hectares would be enough for one cow, to graze one cow. But now suddenly Chromalina invades, and now that carrying capacity increases to 15 hectares. So now you need 15 hectares to graze one cow. So you can see your carrying capacity has been reduced by more than 50%. So if you had 1,000 cows on your farm, now you would only be able to have 500 because 50% of your grazing potential would have been lost. It also impacts on the breeding biology of the Nile crocodile. I'm not going to go into detail with that. Somebody can ask me later if they're interested. And it also obviously has an impact on a number of vertebrate species which are dependent on plants for forage. So what happens is Chromalina displaces indigenous plant species, and these indigenous plant species are very important for many wildlife species to survive, and has big impact on the lowland gorilla, which depends on plant species in the Zingiberacea, which are largely displaced by Chromalina invasions. This is essentially just a map showing the distribution of Chromalina in Eastern Africa, and these green ones here are the protected areas. So what we did in Tanzania, we did a socio-economic survey. So we wanted to find out from people who were affected by Chromalina what the impacts were. And we did a similar study in Indonesia, Tik-Tik. If you can remember, we did a similar study looking at the impacts of Chromalina and what people were saying. And these are just some examples of what people are saying, the impacts of Chromalina. Oh, this quote here: anyone who would help us to eradicate these weeds shall be our God on earth. Agriculture becomes very difficult because of this dangerous plant. Cows produce very little milk these days and weigh as much as a goat. So these are quotes from people that have been affected by Chromalina invasions. And I think the impacts were quite similar in Chromalina, in Indonesia, the impacts of Chromalina, what people were saying. So if we looked at the costs and the benefits of Chromalina in Tanzania, where there was in areas which were had a high density of Chromalina, and areas which had a low density of Chromalina. So the responses here are 82% of people we questioned or we interviewed where Chromalina was very abundant said it had a negative impact on grass. So it decreased the abundance of grass. They said that reduced the abundance of grass. 82% of respondents said it reduced the abundance of grass. 80% of respondents said it reduced the abundance of shrubs. 66% said of people we interviewed said it reduced the abundance of trees, etc. Some even said 67% of people said it decreased the abundance of water. And the results for the low density invasions, areas where the Chromalina had very low densities, the results were obviously not as bad, but still negative. So these plants also have some benefits. So 14% of people said that they use it as a hedge. 17% of people said they use it as medicinal. But 75% of people said it had no benefits at all. So this is just the current and predicted distribution of Chromalina. So this is Chromalina odorata. This is an ecoclimatic model. So here we've modeled the distribution of Chromalina based on climatic variables across the whole world. Okay, so areas which are dark purple, like this, are areas which are ecoclimatically suitable for the invasion of Chromalina odorata. So the dark purple areas are very suitable, and the light areas are less suitable, and obviously the dark areas are areas where it's unlikely to establish and proliferate. So you must remember that Chromalina odorata comes from the Americas, so it comes from this part of the world. It's been accidentally or intentionally introduced to other parts of the world. So you can see here, the whole of Southeast Asia here is climatically suitable for invasions by Chromalina. So this is definitely a weed that's going to get much, much worse in your part of the world. And what we've done here is we've mapped all the protected areas in Africa. So you can see here, these are all the protected areas in Africa. And you can see the ones which are dark purple are ecoclimatically very suitable for Chromalina. So we can imagine that all these protected areas, which are a very dark shade of purple, are very likely to be invaded by Chromalina, and as a result have a negative impact on biodiversity. This is another one, Lantana camara. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Lantana camara. I'm sure many of you grow it as an ornamental in your gardens. Maybe some of you grow it as an ornamental in your hedges. It's one of the most widespread invasive plants in the world. This picture was taken next to Queen Elizabeth National Park in Uganda. You can see here, this is all Chromalina. Not Chromalina, Lantana, sorry, my apologies. This is all Lantana, all here with the pink flowers. It totally dominates the landscape. And here we can look at some of the impacts of Lantana camara these are the impacts globally, at least, of Lantana camara. It's also a big problem in Australia, where it is highly, highly invasive. Also introduced to Australia as an ornamental. And you can see the negative impact there it's having on biodiversity. It's also toxic to livestock. So if livestock eat it, they can become very ill and they can die. So it's responsible for a lot of livestock deaths in Australia and elsewhere around the world. And about 25% of livestock poisonings in South Africa are as a result of livestock eating Lantana camara. So again, here, this is the distribution of Lantana in Eastern Africa. You can see the dark red is where it's invasive, and the orange is where it's present and naturalized. So you can see here in the high rainfall areas, especially around Lake Victoria, it's highly invasive. And this is what happens when livestock eat Lantana. So they often eat Lantana when there's nothing else available, when they are very hungry, or when they're naive. And by naive, I mean they're not familiar with the plant, so they eat it without knowing that it's very toxic. And what happens is the livestock develop a photosensitive reaction. So you can see here they develop these pale markings around their snout and in the white areas along their coat. So they basically get, essentially after eating Lantana, they get sunburnt, if that's what you want to call it. So they become extremely photosensitive. And often they die. Often you'll get these big lesions here on these livestock, as can be seen in this photograph here. So again, we did a socioeconomic survey. We asked people who were living with Lantana, who had Lantana as an invasive species, where they were living, where the communities were living. And these are some of the quotes that we got from people. I have to cut down lantana every 3 months. If I do not, even my doorsteps will be covered in this weed. I'm so exhausted with it that I feel like running away from my land. So what happens is sometimes the invasions get so bad and people can't do anything about it that they abandon their land. So again, we looked at the costs and benefits of lantana in Uganda. So this is negative impacts, but positive impacts, and this is where people said that they weren't aware of the impacts. So you see here, 99% of the people we interviewed said that lantana had a negative impact on grass. 91% of people we interviewed said it had negative impact on shrubs. 79% of people said it had a negative impact on wildlife, and 98% of people we interviewed said it had a negative impact on useful plants. So you can see here, the majority of the impacts are all negative. The majority of people said it all has negative impacts. Some people use the wood as fuel wood, the green manure as a medicinal plant, but very, very few. So you can see here that the negative impacts, again, outweigh the beneficial attributes of lantana. And the interesting thing is we have tsetse fly, which transmits sleeping sickness in Africa, and they're actually attracted to lantana camara. So this is, again, a situation where an invasive plant actually contributes to the abundance of tsetse flies, which has a negative impact on human health. So again, this is just the current distribution of lantana in Eastern Africa. This is the potential distribution based on an eco-climatic model. So you can see the darker the red, the better the climatic match. So again, here you can look at lantana, another eco-climatic model of lantana camara at a global level. So these are the dark green areas are the ones that are most suitable from a climatic perspective for lantana to establish and proliferate. So you can see here, lantana camara is indigenous to the Americas. So it is native to this part of the world. It's been introduced to Africa and to Southeast Asia and to Australia as an ornamental. And you can see here the darker green areas are the areas where it's most likely to establish and proliferate and do very well. So it's very likely that lantana will establish throughout this area, but it will only do well on a few selected islands. Again, here we've looked at the protected areas in Africa. So all these green ones are the protected areas. And you can see the darker the green, the better the climatic match. So all these dark green protected areas are highly likely or highly suitable for lantana camara invasions. Parthenium. I'm not sure how many people of you are familiar with parthenium in Indonesia. I know it's a big problem elsewhere in Southeast Asia. So it's this herb with white flowers here. So you can work done in Ethiopia, for example, found that 90% of farmers considered parthenium to be the worst weed in croplands and pasture. So it's everywhere now within East Africa, but in Ethiopia, when they did a survey, they found that most farmers said it's the worst weed. It has a bigger impact on livestock production and crop production than any other weed. In Australia, where it is also highly invasive, it has massive impact on pasture production, and in some cases will reduce pasture production by up to 90%. If livestock do eat it, it taints their meat and milk. And in terms of human health, if you come into contact with the weed on a regular basis, you can develop severe dermatitis and respiratory problems. So again, here is a weed that is having a negative impact on human health. Okay, so 20% of people who come into contact with this plant on a regular basis will develop severe allergies or respiratory problems. So some researchers did some experiments in Ethiopia where they grew sorghum in fields with parthenium and without parthenium. So sorghum with parthenium weed and sorghum without parthenium weed. And you can see here the results in terms of yields. In areas where they weeded parthenium, you can see how high the yield was. So these are areas where there was no parthenium. Look how high the yield was. In areas where they did not weed Parthenium, look how low the yield was. Okay, again here the next year. Look at the difference here. So it's having an 82 to 95% reduction in yields of sorghum. Just this weed alone, Parthenium, because it's allelopathic. Okay, it releases chemicals in the roots that stop or prevent other plants from growing. And these obviously include our crop plants. So you can look at this picture here. People are growing sorghum. You can see the sorghum is not very healthy. Parthenium is actually outcompeting it in terms of acquiring resources, nutrients, and water, but it's also allelopathic. And through that action, it's reducing the yields of these crops. So we can look at Parthenium here at a global level too. We can do another eco-climatic map. Okay. So Parthenium is native to the Americas. We know it originally comes from the Americas. It's been accidentally introduced to Africa, Southeast Asia, South and Southeast Asia, and Australia. You can see the dark red areas. The darker the red, again, or the orange, the better the climatic match. So we already know it's very invasive in this part of the world. We already know it's very invasive in Eastern Australia. And here you can see that much of Indonesia is climatically suitable for the invasion of Parthenium. So what are farmers going to do now once it becomes invasive? And you can imagine now if you develop allergic reaction to Parthenium, how are you going to be able to weed your croplands? So again, we've looked at the protected areas. And again, you can see that many of the dark red, dark orange, and orange areas are eco-climatically suitable for the invasion of Parthenium. So all these protected areas are highly likely to be invaded if they're not invaded already. So we already know Parthenium is very abundant in many national parks in South Africa and in East Africa. You may not be familiar with cactuses, but many cactus species have been introduced as ornamentals, especially to dry lands around the world. This is a Puntia stricta. You can see the impact it has on livestock production. So what happens is it produces these fruit, and the livestock eat the fruit. And then they develop pear mouth. You can see the mouth of this goat here. You can see how calloused it is, how dry it is. And this is a result of eating cactus fruit, because you know cactus fruit has little thorns on it, little glochids. And those little thorns, they lodge in the lips of the livestock, and they develop what they call pear mouth. A lot of the animals are blinded by the thorns piercing the eyes, and it reduces livestock carrying capacities by up to 50% in invaded areas. So what we did here, we did another socioeconomic survey, and asked the communities what negative impacts the Puntia stricta was having on livelihoods. And you can see here, 100% of people said it had negative impact on tripe quality. That's the intestine, stomach, which people consume. And at 100% of people we interviewed said it had a negative impact on livestock health. And because it's a spiny plant, it's very difficult to walk through the landscape where cactus is a problem. So it obviously has, majority of people said it has an impact on movement access across the landscape. So again, here we have a situation where the negative impacts outweigh the positive impacts. These are just more specific, where we looked at the specific impacts on livestock health. So 87% of people said it had a negative impact, it caused mouth sores. 83% of people interviewed said it caused weight loss in livestock. 74% of people said it caused a negative impact in terms of just general sickness, general illness, produced less milk, etc., etc. So you can see the livestock, most people said it had a negative impact on livestock. The interesting thing is there's a disease called leishmaniasis, which has a big impact on people across the world. And you can see how many people here in Africa are affected by this disease called leishmaniasis. So how is leishmaniasis transmitted? or vectored, and it's been transmitted by sandflies. Okay, so these sandflies occur naturally in the environment. But what happens is sandflies require nectar or require a source of sugar to survive. And where do they get that sugar from? From invasive plants, mainly cactuses. So here we have a situation where the abundance of an invasive plant is contributing to the abundance of a fly, an indigenous fly, which is responsible for vectoring this specific disease. And you can look here, there's data, I think it was data coming out from the Middle East, I think, and you see a cactus fruit. So this is the number of the study they did, and they found that cactus fruit is the second most used source of nectar for introduced for the sandflies, which transmit leishmaniasis. This is another cactus in Lake Baringo in Kenya. I'm not going to go into detail with these, but there are many of them, often introduced as ornamentals. These are Apanthophicus indica invasions in Ethiopia. You can see here everywhere there's cactus across the whole landscape. This is what they call Cylindropanthia fulgida. They call this teddy bear cactus. What happens is sometimes animals are impaled on these spines. So this is a kingfisher which flew into the cactus and died. This is impacts of jointed cactus, another cactus species, which resulted in this young sheep dying. This is not a mongoose, this is a squirrel, which is impaled on this cactus. So cactuses also have a very negative impact on not only in biodiversity, but also on animal health. Then mesquite. I'm just going to talk quickly about Prosopis juliflora. I know it is present in Indonesia. It has been introduced. I'm not sure where, but it potentially has the same impact as Vachellia nilotica has. So the acacia that you have in Baluran National Park, if any of you are familiar with those invasions, Prosopis behaves in a very similar way to Vachellia nilotica. And it's one of the worst woody weeds in Africa, throughout much of Africa, especially in the dry areas. So what you see here everywhere is mesquite. So this is what it looks like in the understory. Nothing else is growing in the understory of Prosopis. It shades out all the other plant species, and it outcompetes them for water and nutrients. So as I mentioned, it has a negative impact on livestock production because it reduces the abundance of grasses in area where it's invaded. It also has an negative impact on biodiversity, but it also has negative impact on underground water resources. Now, they found the roots of mesquite can tap into underground water resources to a depth of 50 meters. So it has a negative impact on a whole range of sectors. So it has a negative impact on livestock production in terms of reducing the amount of palatable plants or the amount of forage species in the landscape, but it also has a negative impact on biodiversity, and it also has a negative impact on water resources. And we did an interesting study in Mali where we looked at if mosquitoes benefit from the presence of this tree species, Prosopis. So what we did is we selected 3 villages in Mali and looked at the abundance of mosquitoes. And if any of you know anything about mosquitoes, mosquitoes need 4 things to survive. Mosquito females need a blood meal. They need standing water and able to breed. They need a source of nectar. So they need energy. So they need to get sugar from somewhere. And they mainly get their sugar from plants, from nectar in plants. And then they also need cool resting sites because they're very prone to desiccation. They're very prone to dry heat. And so they need resting sites in order to survive. So mosquitoes need four critical things in order to survive. And so we looked at Prosopis, and we wanted to determine if the mosquitoes actually benefit from the presence of flowering mesquite, flowering Prosopis within the landscape, because we knew that they actually feed on the flowers of Prosopis. So we selected 3 villages in Mali. In the one village, this last village here, the purple bars, we actually removed, this was the count of mosquitoes, of female mosquitoes, before we removed the flowers of Prosopis. This is female and this is males. Okay, so you can see before we moved the flowers of Prosopis, how many mosquitoes there were. Then we removed the flowers of mosquito, so they no longer had access to nectar, and look at how the population of female mosquitoes dropped and male mosquitoes dropped. Okay, so that I would say is about a 90% decline in male mosquitoes, because they no longer had access to nectar in the flowers of Prosopis, which is invasive. So this is another example of where a mosquito which transmits malaria benefits from the presence of Prosopis. And we might have a situation even in Balaron National Park where mosquitoes are benefiting from the presence of Vachellia nilotica. We won't need to go into that. And this is just an example of work I've been doing in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia. And this is on the Red Sea coastline in the southeast of Saudi Arabia. And this is what the landscape normally looks like. This is virtually a pristine landscape in Southeast Asia, in Saudi Arabia. And then what happens is where these duam palms are growing, you get the establishment of mesquite, which is this invasive tree I've just been talking about. Near the palms, and then these trees, these invasive shrubs start proliferating. And you can see there's some duam palms, and here's Prosopis, mesquite, the invasive tree, is starting to become more abundant. And then it becomes more and more abundant, and more abundant, and eventually it dominates the whole landscape. Now, you may ask, why am I showing you this? And this is because you can see you have a landscape here which is dominated by sand. So about 70–80% of this landscape here is dominated by sand with very few plants. This landscape is totally dominated by mesquite. So what does this have an implication for climate change? And you might be asking, well, what impact is this possibly going to have on climate change? And I don't know if any of you have heard of the albedo effect. The albedo effect is essentially how much sunlight that reaches the planet's surface is reflected back into the atmosphere. So you can imagine here you have a very white surface, and much of this surface, this landscape is white, is sand. So most of the sunlight that hits this landscape is reflected back into the atmosphere. Okay? But most of the sunlight which hits this green landscape is absorbed. Okay? Because if you're wearing if you go out into the sun wearing white clothes, just white clothes, you will not get as hot as if you go into the sunlight wearing black clothes. Because black clothes will absorb the heat and white clothes will reflect the heat. So it's the same in these landscapes. What's happening is in these landscapes, which are not invaded, most of the sunlight, most of the heat is reflected back into the atmosphere. In these landscapes, most of the heat is absorbed, less is reflected. So invaded landscapes may actually be contributing to climate change. Many of you may be familiar with Tithonia, Mexican sunflower, which is another invasive in Indonesia and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, but also in Africa. It has a negative impact on crop production and on biodiversity. These are just some of the Tithonia species which occur in Africa and their distribution. And again, in Zambia, we did a socioeconomic study to determine how many people thought it was having a negative impact and how many people thought it was beneficial and how many people did not know. And you can see here, most of the people saw invasions of Mexican sunflower as a cost. So prevented movement and access. 63% of people said a negative impact on grass cover, etc. This was an early stage of invasion, so the effects, negative impacts, were not as clear. But we know from subsequent studies that the impacts, negative impacts, are increasing over time as Tithonia starts dominating in the landscape. Then mimosa. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Mimosa pigra in Indonesia. It's extremely bad weed. It's very bad throughout Southeast Asia. It's a semi-aquatic weed invading wetlands and riparian zones and floodplains. And this is here, it's a spiny shrub from South America. You can see here, this is all Chromalina in a national park, not Chromalina, Mimosa pigra. My apologies again, Mimosa pigra in a national park. So you can see here some of the negative impacts, for example, in Vietnam, negative impacts that it's having in Australia. In work done in Zambia, for example, it reduced bird diversity by almost 50% and bird abundance by more than 95%. So where these floodplains were invaded by Mimosa pigra, it was reducing bird diversity by 50%, and it was having a significant impact on abundance. And there are also some information coming from Cambodia. You can see here, farmers have ranked mimosa as the most significant problem affecting rice farming, more so than rodents, other pests, and drought. So the farmers in Cambodia were saying Mimosa pigra was the biggest problem for them. It was a bigger problem for them than any crop pest. And it's a very, very difficult weed to control. And it also has a negative impact on fishing activity and blocks access to water bodies. So what we did here in Zambia, we also did another study. We interviewed people. We asked them if Mimosa pigra had costs and benefits. So almost 100% of people said it had a negative impact on grass. 97.5% people said it had a negative impact on shrubs. 98% of people we interviewed said it had negative impact on trees, etc. Almost 98% people said it had negative impact on crop production, negative impact on the number of fish they were able to catch. So here again, we've been able to demonstrate that an invasive plant, Mimosa pigra, was having a significant impact on livelihoods in communities. And these are just maps of the current distribution of Mimosa pigra in Africa. And this is an ecoclimatic model showing which areas are ecoclimatically suitable for invasion of Mimosa pigra in Africa. And again, you can see most of our protected areas in Africa are ecoclimatically suitable for invasion. So we can predict, in a sense, that most of these protected areas will be invaded by Mimosa pigra. And these maps are quite important because they would demonstrate, or at least act as an early warning system for protected area managers. So we could show protected area managers these maps, and we could say, it is highly likely that your protected area will be invaded by Mimosa pigra. So you really have to prevent its introduction in the first place. And if you see it, you should eradicate it as soon as possible. So this is why these ecoclimatic maps are very valuable from an early detection and rapid response plan. Then another weed, which some of you may be familiar with, is Mimosa diplotricha, creeping sensitive plant. It's obviously in the same genus as Mimosa pigra. It also has small spines on the stems. And you can see here, it's invading maize fields here. Very hard to control. It has those little spines. If you hand pull, those little spines break off into your hand. You can see this hut here is almost being overgrown by Mimosa diplotricha. And here are just some of the negative impacts it has in different parts of the world. It's toxic, so very abundant in Thailand. You can see it contributed to the death of some swamp butterflies, swamp buffaloes, not butterflies. You can confuse between insects and buffaloes, but has a negative impact on livestock production, etc. And again, here we did another social. We interviewed people to try and determine negative impacts. We did the study in Malawi, and you can see 99% of people we interviewed said a negative impact on grass. 72% of people interviewed said a negative impact on shrubs. So again, the negative costs in terms of impacts on people outweighed the positive or the benefits that people said it might have. And here again are some quotes on the impacts of Mimosa diplotricha on livelihoods, on people. These are some of the things that people said. In 2015, I was in hospital with my son. Mimosa took over my rice garden and I harvested nothing. If chemicals to eradicate mimosa could be found, it would be very helpful. So these quotes are very useful in telling us what impacts some of these invasive weeds are having on livelihoods. I'm not going to go into detail on any of these other weeds. This is another one. Tek, I saw in your book that this is been identified as an invasive plant, or is present at least in Indonesia. It's rubber vine, Cryptosthesia grandiflora. It poses a significant threat to pasture production around the world. People grow it as an ornamental because it's got these pretty purple flowers. And it was introduced to Australia as an ornamental, where it became invasive. And you can see in Australia, it was estimated to occupy more than 30,000 square kilometers in 1990, and it was described as the single biggest threat to natural ecosystems in tropical Australia. Dense infestations can reduce livestock carrying capacities by as much as 100%. So wherever the plant is present, you can't graze your livestock. It just dominates the landscape and it displaces all your valuable forage plants. So this is a plant that's been grown in Indonesia as an ornamental and has a huge potential to become invasive. And again, we did this ecoclimatic model. You can see here much of Africa is ecoclimatically suitable for invasion by rubber vine. But the good thing about this plant is it's been brought under good control in Australia due to the introduction of a pathogen, a fungus, which attacks this plant. So I spoke initially about, and this is just a quick summary, what will happen to natural grazing lands if we don't manage invasive plants? Well, 71% of natural grazing will be lost, at least in South Africa. And I imagine in Indonesia it will be the same. If invasive plants are not managed, most of your natural grazing will be lost. If we don't weed, what happens if we don't weed? This is what happens if we don't weed. If we don't weed, most of our crop yields will be lost. So if you don't weed in maize, you will lose 55 to 90% of your yield. If you don't weed in rice, you will lose 50 to 100% of your yield. If you don't weed in cassava, you will lose up to 90% of your yield. So invasive weeds have the biggest impact on crop production. And we also published this paper. You can look at it. Would the control of invasive alien plants reduce malaria transmission? It was published in Parasites and Vectors. You can read more about basically a summary of invasive alien plants and malaria. And then we also did a paper on zoonotics and ecological countermeasures for preventing zoonotic disease outbreaks when ecological restoration is a human health imperative. So what we're saying, it is critical to manage invasive alien plant species because they contribute to landscape degradation, and through that they will contribute to the outbreak of zoonotic diseases. And then we recently did a paper on the economic costs of invasive alien species to African crop and livestock production. So invasives have a massive cross-cutting impact, and I just want to quickly talk about management a bit because I think I'm running out of time. I think I've got about 5 minutes left. So the major barriers to IAS management is little to no coordination. So what I tried to show in my presentation was that invasive alien species have a cross-cutting impact. It's not just about biodiversity, but it's about crop production, it's about livestock production, it's about human health, it's about water resources, it's about fire. If we don't start working together as a government to address this issue, we are not going to resolve it. We must stop thinking it's just a biodiversity issue. We all have to start working together across ministries, across departments to address this issue. One ministry cannot do so alone. We have to take hands. There are often insufficient policies to address the issue of invasive alien species. There are insufficient cross-cutting policies to address invasive alien species. And if there are, often they're not implemented. Or if they are implemented, they're implemented very poorly. There's little awareness in many countries about the impacts of invasive species. There's little capacity to actually manage invasive alien species. There are insufficient resources, so there's not enough money to manage them. There are no landscape-wide interventions. So often interventions are very localized, so only in a protected area or a nature reserve, but they don't look at management across a whole landscape. Often no herbicides. We found in many low and middle income countries that don't have herbicides registered for use against many environmental weeds, which is a real challenge. So the best way to control many of these invasive plants is not possible because we don't have the herbicides to do so. And there's little support for biocontrol. And let me just use one example for biocontrol quickly. So myself and Michael Day and others did a couple of papers where we looked at biocontrol. Now, biological control is the most cost-effective intervention you can do for management of invasive alien plant species. And we looked at the number of countries in Africa. We excluded South Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, and the number of weeds each country has targeted for classical biological control. So CBC stands for classical biological control. So all you have to worry about are these gray bars here. So you can see number of countries that have targeted 1 to 3 weeds for biocontrol, it's only 10. So out of all the countries in Asia, only 10 have targeted 1 to 3 weeds for biocontrol, despite the fact that there are so many invasive alien plant species. Only 3 countries have targeted 4 to 6 weeds. Only 7 to 9 countries, only 7 to 9 weeds have been targeted in about 2 countries, and only 1 country in the whole of Asia has targeted 10 to 12 weed species. We want to look at the number of countries in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, and the number of years since weed biocontrol were intentionally released. Look at Asia. In the last 5 years, no biological control agents were released in any Asian countries. And even then, 6 to 10 years ago, it was 3 countries, 11, 15 years. What you would expect, theoretically, is for this graph to increase. As the number of weeds gets worse, we should have been introducing more biocontrol agents. But in fact, it stayed relatively constant. And there seems to be less and less support for biocontrol in Asia. So this is just about biocontrol successes. I'm not going to go into detail, but the cost benefits of biocontrol are really quite phenomenal. You can see a study done on water hyacinth, where they looked at biocontrol in southern Benin. The economic returns, so for every $1 invested in biocontrol, economic returns were 149. All the cost benefit studies that have been done in South Africa, for example, the benefits ranged from 34 to 1. So for every $1 invested, the lowest return on that was 34, and the highest return was 4,331. So it really is a cost-effective investment to make. So what we're saying is that for every $1, for example, this result here, for every $1 we invested in research and the subsequent introduction of the biocontrol, the benefits were 4,331. So it really is, in many respects, the most cost-effective intervention for invasive alien plant management. So this is just quickly a list of agents available for Indonesian weeds. So these are plant species for which biological control agents have been released elsewhere in the world. So there are quite a number of species for which we have potential biocontrol agents. So introducing and releasing these in Indonesia will be far more cost effective than having to do all the research again, because we know already what the best agents are and that they are host specific. So there are a lot of opportunities for Indonesia, at least for biocontrol. And if cost is an issue, then this is the route we need to follow. We need to look at the introduction of host-specific and damaging biocontrol agents. So these are just some of the books we've written on invasive alien plants around the world. These books are freely available for download on the internet, so you can go to CABI's website, you can download them at no cost. Any of these field guides provides information on management, on control options, etc., etc. So feel free to go to CABI's website if you're interested in downloading any of these books and learning more about invasive alien plants and animals. This is the one we did on animals for Caribbean. So, in conclusion, the situation regarding invasive alien species in Indonesia is becoming worse as we speak. There are solutions. There are solutions to every problem. Okay? It's not as if we cannot manage invasive species, but we need to start working together to address the scourge because it has huge implications for human livelihoods, for economic growth, if we don't manage invasive alien species. Is it worse than climate change or not? I don't know. But we know that invasive alien species are going to benefit as a result of climate change. So increased carbon dioxide levels are going to make the growth of invasive alien plant species a lot worse. So invasive plants are growing a lot faster now than they did in the past. So the situation is getting worse. And the time to act is now. I don't think we can afford to wait. I think we need to address all those barriers that I mentioned previously to get on top of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnie. Thank you for the nice talk. You know, you're afraid at the beginning that you won't be able to finish within 1 hour. Now, when you start talking about invasive alien species, no one can stop you. Anyway,
I'm sorry.
I think we can directly go to the question and answer, but before that, I think we still have some people here, and then we will take a photo shoot. Aradisti, before we proceed with the question and answer, I think we will take a picture. We have 71. Yeah, we have 71 people here. Radisti, are you ready, Radisti, for the page one?
Yes, I will stop sharing the
Yes,
slides
of course.
from Dr. Witt. Okay.
We can take a picture. Give the best pose. Everyone, please open your camera.
So I have 3 slides here. The first slide, everyone.
The first, okay.
1, 2, 3.
And then second one.
The second one. 1, 2, and 3.
Done. And then the third one.
The final one. 1, 2, and 3. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Radisti. Arnie, I think we have some question from the chat box, but I think if those people are willing to talk or raise hand or discuss directly with you, I think we will try to invite, yeah. Pak Khairil Anwar Siregan, are you there? Professor, there are 2 professors here raising or anyone raising their hand? Because I will try to prioritize those who raising hand here. Anyone? Because I think Arnie has highlighted some of the important action here. We admit that in Indonesia we are very lacking in coordination, and then the second one is the awareness, Arnie. Yeah, very little awareness about how dangerous actually about the impact of invasive alien species, not only from the plants, yeah, actually the move one, the animal, yeah, and then especially with the commercial, the pet trade, and then through the e-commercial. So anyone raise the hand, or if there is no one raise the hand, anyone? Radisti, did you see anyone raise their hand? I don't see here.
Just now, Professor Hairil Anwar Sregar raised
Is he
his
here?
hand. And then
Okay, Pak Hairil, Professor Hairil, are you there? Hello.
Hello.
Ah,
Hello.
okay, okay.
Thank you for giving me chance. Actually, I wrote down already my
Yeah, it's
questions
okay.
there.
It's okay. Directly is
Yeah.
more is better.
Yeah, thank you, Arnie. Very best presentations. Well, just one little questions. We have Titi knows that Nilotica, Acacia nilotica problems in Baluran, right?
Yep.
Is there any biological control already? And also chromolina problem. Is there any biological control exists yet? And how efficient is that? Thank you.
Arnie, you can just respond
Okay.
directly.
Okay. Yes, Acacia nilotica is a big problem in Baluran. We know that the Australians have looked at biocontrol, and the Australians have introduced some biocontrol agents. Tik can correct me if I'm wrong, but at some stage we were looking at introducing one of these biocontrol agents to Baluran from Australia. I think they did some testing, but I'm not sure if it was ever released. But we need to consider the introduction of additional biocontrol agents for Acacia in Baluran. I know I did the surveys for potential biocontrol agents, so there's huge potential also for the introduction of biocontrol agents for Acacia nilotica. As for Chromolina, one agent has been introduced already, and it has established in Indonesia. It's a little gallfly called Cecidocorus. It is having an impact, but not as big as an impact as we'd hoped. But a number of additional agents have been also subsequently been introduced to South Africa. So there is potential to introduce more agents, which we know are host-specific and damaging, from South Africa to Indonesia once we've done additional host range testing and we've been able to determine that they are host-specific. So yes, to your questions, and thank you for those questions, there are opportunities for biocontrol for both of these species.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Arnie. Just adding information about the question that you raised, Arnie, about when we start to import the biological agent from Australia. Actually, we have to struggle because we have to fight with the Biological Agent Commission because they still, they still need to convince whether this is importation of the biological agent from overseas, from Australia, will not cause any other damage because they worry that, the another exotic species coming into Indonesia, then it will give the same problem with the snail predator that you also mentioned because of the not adequate host specificity testing, and then they spread and then they eat the other local species, something like that. So they are still worried about whether we can convince them it is 100% secure that it's going to be eating only or predating only on those species, something like that. So we still struggle for that one. So it is not continue at that time. So with the new, actually, our new project has not yet started, yeah, the SMIAS. Actually, we try to continue with trying to work with importing the biological agent from the Africa because we have already started a long time back, yeah, Arnie. That's additional information about the first question from Pak Hairil. Okay, now we can go to, actually, I will read the second question. Yeah, the second question actually from the chat box. This is from Professor Didi. Yeah. Are there any good example of effective biological controls of introduced alien species in important or major horticultural crops. There is biological control that does not cause any other biological or environmental problem that could develop even more seriously in new favorable environment. This is about the horticulture crops.
I mean, in terms of biocontrol,
Yes.
it is very critical. It is very critical now for us to undertake host range testing. So we do many studies, many detailed studies to confirm that these biocontrol agents are host specific and they pose absolutely no threat to crop production or native plant species. So we will not introduce any biocontrol agent that poses any risk. Country like South Africa, we have already introduced over 100 biocontrol agents in South Africa, targeting more than 50 weeds, and there's been not one recorded non-target impact. So if done properly, it is safe and it is effective in general. There are some cases where it has not been so effective, but there are various good reasons for that. You mentioned the snail. We would never consider introducing a snail nowadays with the knowledge that we have available. And we also have to recognize that many of these non-target impacts that did occur were predicted prior to release of these agents. So they predicted that the rosy wolf snail would feed on other species, but they still went ahead. So we are very careful about non-target impacts. And we also know now with crop pests, we often introduce predators and parasitoids to control crop pests. Parasitoids are generally more host specific because they generally only attack the target species, but there are some exceptions. And predators to control crop pests are more generalists, and they do pose a threat to native biodiversity. But we have to weigh up the costs against the benefits. For example, the costs would be increased pesticide use. So if we practice IPM, integrated pest management, by using natural enemies, we can reduce the use of pesticides, and through that, we can reduce non-target impacts on biodiversity. So it's these compromises and these very difficult decisions that we have to make going forward in terms of conserving biodiversity. And we're also sitting now with a situation where we have herbicide resistance. Many weeds are resistant to herbicides. Many crop pests are resistant to pesticides. How are we going to control them unless we practice or utilize natural enemies?
Thank you. So I mean that the key point is we have to do a lot of research just to make sure that those are worried from, those are concerned about whether this is going to be inviting a big impact after we introduce the new biological agent, something like that. And then the second one is the host specificity testing. Yeah. So I mean that the strong research are very important here, isn't it?
I agree, Tik. And I think what also needs to happen, Tik, is we have to be uniform in how we apply the law. Okay.
Yep.
If we've had no incidents, none of the agents that have been released on Chromalina have had non-target impacts. None of the agents that were released on Mimosa pigra have had non-target impacts. So all the agents, none of the water hyacinth agents have had non-target impacts. So you have to look at the examples that you have from your own country in terms of non-target impacts. But what we also need to do is anyone, I think most people in Indonesia, if you own a pet shop or you own a nursery, you can almost introduce any plant you want, even if it's potentially invasive. So we are saying it is wrong to introduce biocontrol agents that are there to protect biodiversity, but we can continue to introduce other pets that could be invasive, other plants which could be invasive.
Yeah.
There's not the law is not being equally.
Yes, of course. That's a big juggling about that. This is related to next question. Actually, it's already been responded. Yeah. This is from Agus Kurniawan, just asking about there are several control or extermination option. Do you think control using natural enemy is effective? asking about whether it is effective or not using the natural enemy.
Well, it's very effective. So when I
Mhm.
previously at the end of my talk, I gave you some costs and benefits. So for some species where we introduce biocontrol agents, for the research cost, for every $1 of research money we spent, the benefits were over $4,000. So in all cases, almost all cases where we've done research on the costs and benefits of biocontrol, the benefits have always outweighed the costs. And the nice thing about biocontrol, Tik, which you need to remember, and everyone participating in this workshop, is that biocontrol agents, once they've established and they're doing well, they work all the time. They work 24/7. They work, they don't go on strike. They don't ask for higher wages. You know, they don't complain about the heat or the cold. They continue controlling the target species. So this is why they're very cost effective, because a damaging biocontrol agent can save us a lot of money in terms of physical and chemical control. So, and they also asked about climate change. And you must remember that the host range of an insect or a pathogen will not be affected by climate change. Okay.
Yeah, I know. That's why probably, perhaps we have once released the Cecidocaris connexa in 1990, by Biotrop. That was for Chromalena odorata. But the problem is we are very, very we are lacking in the post-release evaluation. Yeah, so we don't know yet about the progress. And then outside there is a lot of parasite, yeah, that eating the Cecidocaris, so that's why they cannot grow, they cannot proliferate very well, yeah. And then they are beaten up by the fast growth of the Chromalena as well. But again, this is also happening, I think, everywhere, yeah, about the Mimosa pigra, and I think Indonesia now. It seems like we have to start with the education, yeah. We have to start with the improving the awareness, start from the school age, yeah, because this is different from the Australia or Africa. Now they start to introduce awareness on the dangerous or damage of the invasive species to the environment since they are very young, yeah. So I think this is the key point. So this is actually okay. We have another one question. This is quite long actually, Arnie, but I think you can memorize this, yeah? This is
Yeah,
from...
I'll see that. I'll see the question.
You see the question from the chat box?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great.
How do you know if livestock have been poisoned by Chromalena? And well, you'll see it. They'll get very sick, and they'll develop lesions, and they'll start losing condition. And the best way to obviously determine that is to get a vet to have a look at your livestock and to do an analysis. So some of the signs of poisoning are initially very visible. You can actually see the livestock getting ill or that they have been poisoned. And then you have to call a vet, and the vet will obviously do a diagnosis and then recommend some treatment for your livestock. So how does the planting of herbicide-resistant tolerant plant varieties affect population distribution of... Look, I mean, there's been a lot of debate about the introduction of genetically modified plants, especially herbicide-resistant or glyphosate-resistant plants, and what impacts that has on the environment. As far as I'm aware, there'll be no significant negative impacts on the environment in terms of genetically modified crops that have been introduced, and in terms of them hybridizing with closely related native species, and through that developing some form of hybrid resistance. So I don't think I'm sure about the question, but I don't think that genetically modified crops impact biodiversity at all, as far as I'm aware, and as far as the literature goes. There is a lot of people who postulated potential negative impacts, but there's no good data to support it. I'm interested in the impact of invasive alien species on water. Well, that's a good one. You have huge problems with water weeds in Indonesia. Some of them make the water distasteful. I think the biggest impact is water use. Something like water hyacinth, you lose 7 times as much water through evapotranspiration than you would if your water body was not covered by water hyacinth. So water weeds have a significant impact on water quantity. They obviously also have a negative impact on hydroelectricity water generation because they block the turbines. That's a huge issue. The water weeds obviously also shade out the plants growing below the water surface. So they obviously also have an impact on aquatic diversity. And water weeds also contribute or benefit a lot of insects and other animals which are vectors of particular diseases, like snails, which are vectors of bilharzia, for example, tend to proliferate on water bodies that are infected or invaded by water weeds. And yeah, in some cases, like azolla can make water very distasteful, so it can affect the quality or the taste of your drinking water. So water weeds have significant negative impacts on biodiversity, water quality, and on water quantity.
Okay. I think there is still one question left. That's about Tithonia and Chromalina.
Yeah.
From an agricultural perspective, Tithonia
Okay,
diversifolia.
yeah,
Same.
that's a very good question. Every plant has costs and benefits. You know, especially those which have been intentionally introduced. People would not intentionally introduce a plant species if it didn't have some sort of benefit, if they were not going to make money or something from them. So some people will introduce a plant because they think it has medicinal value. So it's very important to understand that there are costs and benefits of the introduction of invasive species. So what you have to do before you look at these issues, you have to look at the costs of the invasions and the benefits of those invasions. And in most cases, and almost all cases, we've done cost-benefit analysis. The costs of invasions outweigh the benefits. So you look at lantana. Lantana, for example, people grow it as a nice ornamental plant or as a hedge. So they think it's beautiful. But at the same time, it has a negative impact on biodiversity, has a negative impact on livestock health, has a negative impact on pasture production. So you've got to weigh the costs against the benefits. In terms of utilization, will utilization control these plant species? No, it will not. Because utilization is not control. Through utilization you are just harvesting. It's like picking apples from a tree. If you pick apples from a tree, you're not killing the tree. You're just using the fruits from that tree. If you cut down lantana, for example, you will cut it down, or Tithonia, you'll cut the Tithonia down, you will utilize the green manure, the leaves as a green manure, but the plant will grow back. You will not remove or kill the plant. You will not apply herbicide to the cut stump. Because if you become dependent on a natural resource, you will not want to eradicate it. That is the challenge. So as soon as you create a dependency on an invasive alien species, it becomes extremely difficult to manage it. And that is the challenge we face. And we have found throughout the world where utilization has been promoted as a management strategy, it has failed completely. So utilization does not contribute to control in any way whatsoever. In fact, it may make the situation worse because it may drive people to spread the plant to other parts of the world because they see it as a valuable crop or as a valuable resource. So I think we should get rid of Tithonia and Chromalina because the costs definitely outweigh the benefits.
Yeah. Thank you, Arnie. I do have a question as well because I'm worried about this how people now use the terminology of bioprospecting. Some people they start to think about having those considering those invasive alien plants become bioprospecting. Yeah. So, for example, like if they use the Eichhornia crassipes, the Eichhornia, and then passiflora, and then they're always thinking about the benefit of using it, and then they start to think about the benefit, the benefit of using it as a medicine or as a source of food, something like that. So they put it under the term of the bioprospecting. What do you think about it? For me personally, I'm not agree with it, because I thought that bioprospecting must be related to the biodiversity, the local biodiversity, but not from the biodiversity that is coming from non-native species, something like that. What do you think? What do you think about this?
Well, that's why I said you've got to come back and you've got to do a cost-benefit analysis. Determine the costs outweigh the benefits, and in most cases they won't. And in most cases, there's an important saying, Tik, which we should all remember. It is socializing costs, and what are they? What I'm trying to say is that inevitably, with utilization of invasive species, is that a few people benefit from the use of invasive species, but the majority carry the cost. Okay, so that's very important to recognize. All these cases, if you look at the impacts of invasive species, there will always be some people who develop a use for these and they benefit, they make a lot of money, but the majority of people suffer. And the people who are benefiting are generally those people who are financially more secure, so they have more impact in terms of politically and other means, whereas the poor people who are generally voiceless are the ones that suffer the most. And the saying that I was thinking of is it's socializing costs and privatizing profits. Okay. And that is important, socializing costs and privatizing profits. And this is what essentially happens when people start utilizing invasive alien species. And when we look at medicinal value, for example, for medicinal value, you maybe need 1 or 2 leaves of a plant. You don't need 1 million hectares of a plant. Okay. And even if you controlled the plant, you would not eradicate it completely. It's not possible. So those people that want to use it can use it, but it must be part of an integrated management strategy. It cannot be on its own. It cannot work on its own. It's never worked anywhere in the world on its own. What people are thinking is they're thinking through utilization, you can control it. You will never be able to control it because you won't use enough of it. And the reason why, you've got to ask yourself the question, why is this plant invasive? And the plant is invasive is because people have no use for it. If the plant was useful, it wouldn't be invasive, would it?
That's true.
Question you. I mean, it's crazy. People say, well, the plant is useful. And then you say, well, why does it
they become
proliferate?
invasive? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I always talk to my student and my colleague, that we have to make sure that everyone understands that if we are using them or we're taking a benefit of them, it's just a matter of trying to control them, because there is no natural enemy. So we are acting as a natural enemy while they are not existed. Yeah. So we have a lot of example where some of the species in some area become invasive, and in the other area they're not becoming invasive because some people make use of it, to control them. But again, the problem is how to spread this information across the Indonesian island, which is very open, and then all the exactly that all this kind of movement are very easily from one island to the other island. So what I was concerned is when you talk about the prosopis, the prosopis, even up until now, I'm trying to find out what is look like the Prosopis jucifol, the Prosopis jucifloria, Yeah, the Prosopis julifloria. Because last time I heard that it's just coming from, it was in Java or in East Kalimantan, this Prosopis julifloria, because coming from Malaysia. But up until now, we haven't detected yet where this prosopis actually existed. About the Parthenium, I think Parthenium from America, Historoporus, yeah. This is also we take the serious concern about this because it causes severe dermatitis and also allergic, yeah. And then last time we found that this is from East Kalimantan as well because coming across the Sabah, yeah. But we haven't heard the progress until now, yeah. But the prosopis one is the one that I concern. I think if you got an information about where and how does it come from, why they introduced that to Indonesia, then it must be better to for us, yeah, because I haven't heard about these two species coming in, the
Okay.
prosopis
Yeah,
and Parthenium.
I'll send a link to you. I'll
Yeah,
send that
yeah,
information.
yeah,
Yeah.
because I couldn't get it that one. Anyway,
The last question is a very good one, I think. It's a very interesting one.
yes, that's from the Professor Khairil Anwar. Can you comment on that one? Because it might be, this is like open-ended question.
Well, the problem is God didn't bring Chromalina to Indonesia. God didn't bring Acacia nilotica to Indonesia. People did. And by doing that, they are destroying God's creation. And that is the challenge. So yeah, I mean, some people have said that plants are only weeds because people haven't discovered their beneficial attributes yet. And people have come up with all these stories about weeds and that weeds can be controlled through utilization and every plant must have a use. But there are many plants that have an ecological use but no human use at all. There are no benefits. In terms of Parthenium, for example, I mean, some people claim it's got medicinal properties, but I doubt that very much. But essentially every plant can have some sort of medicinal benefits. And if you believe that it will help you or it won't, or some do benefit you, obviously, from a scientific perspective. But yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think the key thing is it's we introduced those plants and those insects, and it's not God. And God never introduced them for a reason.
Yes, that's a good answer actually, because we actually doesn't even if we have already planned it very well in the very beginning that we are going to introduce this new species, and then we make sure that it won't spread fast, it won't be invasive, but at the end something happened along the way. Yeah, something happened along the way. So I think the important thing is we have to aware, we have to be careful, and we have to be, we have to promote what's so-called the early detection and rapid response. This is happening when we have a COVID last time, yeah? If we want to make sure that this is not going to be dangerous to us or damaging our environment, so we are the one who has to setting up the safeguard on it, yeah. So we have to aware of this, how much it's dangerous. If we don't know how much they damage, how much it's going to deplete our local biodiversity, so we don't know what we are going to do, how we can mitigate the impact, the negative impact, because beyond our conscious at the moment, that a lot of impact actually is already being happening. For example, like in one of the lake, yeah, in Danau Limboto, yeah, Danau Limboto is in Sulawesi. It's no longer a lake now. The water is gone because of sedimentation. Started with the invasion of the Ecornia crassipes, yeah, with the Ecornia crassipes, and then coming in a lot of Pragmites and then Mycenia and everything. Now it's gone. And then we knew exactly that there is a lot of huge economic loss about that, but no one calculate, and then no one care about how to put it back again, and then how much actually lost to the local government because they lost of the tourism coming for, to the lake, yeah, the Lake Limboto. We call it Lake Limboto. This is also, I thought that this is going to happen in Ranupane Lake in Bromo Tengger. You know exactly, Arni, we work in Bromo Tengger Semeru, yeah. And then now still we cannot handle the invasion of Salvinia molesta. Yeah. Although it was the biological agent is already there, but again, the root causes of this invasion are still there. Yeah, we cannot handle it because of the agriculture practices on the upstream. Yeah, and then we cannot change that. All this theory of change is that it doesn't work because of, you know, exactly, it is difficult to deal with the local, not the local community, actually, all those people, yeah, all level of the people, the government, the officer, and then the community as well, and then even the public, yeah, and even the trader for the pesticide, because they still use the pesticide, yeah, for the agriculture. So I mean, we have to work hand in hand in handling this invasive alien species issue. Yeah, Arnie, agree with that one. For that, I think before I still invite, we still have another 5 minutes if we can have one additional question actually coming from the floor. If you wish, probably Radisti or any other
Yeah,
would like to.
There are some questions there.
The last one again from Nurfianto, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, what do you do about native weeds?
Mhm.
You know, the story about, I don't think we've resolved the story about Miramia peltata.
Oh yeah.
Because we still need to do the genetic work to determine if it's native or introduced. And with some of these species, you know, if they're being moved from one island to another, they might be indigenous to Indonesia, but they might have been introduced to an island where they never occurred previously. And that's one of the things we're thinking about why Miramia has become a problem, because the natural enemies associated with it are not present in areas in Indonesia. Is invasive. Yeah, I mean, in terms of Aringa, yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's really, we're living in a changing world, and the whole structure of our vegetation and composition of vegetation is going to change as a result of climate change. So increased carbon dioxide levels are going to benefit some plant species more than others. So our vegetation structure and composition is going to change over time. There's no doubt about that. And then the other issues associated with some indigenous weedy species that proliferate, and that could be because of an absence of fires, or too frequent fires, or too hot fires, or, you know, many species are benefiting from anthropogenic changes that are happening at a global level. And so the question is, yeah, some of these obviously indigenous or native weeds are all pioneers. That's the important thing to remember, that a lot of these plant species which are problematic are also pioneers, and they're very important in terms of plant succession. So these weedy species might be bad for a farmer, but in terms of natural succession of a forest or whatever the case may be, they might be very, very, very important. But if there are no natural enemies available to manage these, then we have to do so ourselves. So we have to look at various other management interventions to control them, either through cut stump treatment or application of foliar treatment or whatever. But the challenge for us, Tik, is how do we manage our landscapes going forward? Do we manage them to what they looked like 100 years ago? Or do we manage them what they looked like 50 years ago? Or do we manage them or now into the future what they look like now? And that's a real challenge, and it's very hard to predict because there's so many factors that have come into play. So I'm not sure if I've answered that, but yes, a lot of indigenous species can become problematic, and that's often driven by anthropogenic changes in the environment. And then the thing about schools, universities, because research directed the utilization of weed as raw material, natural medicine. Yeah, I mean, this is quite interesting. I think in terms of education, there might be a bias in terms of trying to paint the picture that all these species are beneficial and that can be utilized and that people are going to become very rich by utilizing them. But I think we need to provide a bit of a balance in terms of education to make people aware. This is what education is about. is providing students with an objective view, a very balanced view, and then letting students make up their own decision or their own mind in terms of what they see is the correct answer. But yes, I mean, it's like when we used at Baliran, when we developed the plan. The plan for Acacia nilotica was to utilize the biomass that we were harvesting in Baliran to pay for the control. So we were going to utilize the wood from Baliran for firewood or furniture, whatever the case may be. But we were going to remove those trees permanently. So we're going to apply herbicides. We're going to cut them and apply herbicide. So we're not saying that you should not utilize an invasive species. What we're saying is you can utilize an invasive species as long as it's part of an integrated strategy. Utilization on its own is very dangerous. It does not work. It's got to be part of an integrated strategy. That's the key point.
Thank you, Arnie. I think that's a good point to remember at this stages, that actually we are not going to solely single depending, trying to make use of the single species, which is actually can create a big damage. For example, I want to respond again with the case of the arenga that Yayan asking. Actually, the spread of arenga, which is actually the local species, is due to the one. I read one of two paper talking about it was due to the explosion of the civet population, Arnie, that is actually dispersing the seed, yeah? So no one care about that as well. So this has caused a big disruption in the balance of the local wildlife population. So I mean that it's a very complicated process actually. So I think that's a good point that everyone should be aware of the impact, yeah, the impact of not only for the environment but also for the health, yeah, for the health issue, and then also for the, you know, like across the sectors, you know, not only health but also the social, the infrastructure, and then the farming, yeah, the cattle, and then everything. I think, Arnie, thank you very much. We are actually coming to the end of the webinar session, and then before that, Radisti, I think Brin will try to. This is not much actually, yeah, Arnie, but it was like just trying to present a token of appreciation from Brin. This is the certificate for you, Arnie. Yeah, thank you very much for sharing the knowledge. And then this is very thoughtful and very valuable for us. Yeah, especially with invasive alien species, which is the issue is quite new to us. Yeah, and then we learn so much from you now. So Arnie, please accept this certificate for you from us for Brin. And then if there is no further question, then everyone feel free to contact Arnie in his email address. Arnie, have you already got the show the email address in your paper presentation? Yeah, we will distribute to all the participants. Yeah, and if they are interested in communicating with you, they can contact you via email, yeah, Arnie. Yeah, and then of course we are going to communicate soon if the project Jeff 8 will start. Yeah, they said it's going to be 2025. We will see whether it is going to be put in the reality or not. Yeah, the project, the Jeff 8 with the strengthening for invasive alien species. Sorry, wait a minute. Sorry. Sorry. I'm in the middle of and then if this is happening, so it's going to be a lot of collaboration, especially with the government agency, because we are now have what's called the Indonesian Quarantine Agency, which is a long time back. We are started to develop this, and then because the issue is cross-sectoral, so we are going to make a lot of what's called the derivative regulation, the cross-sectoral regulation. So we need some support, funding support from the Jeff. So hopefully, just cross this finger that this is going to happen soon. Yeah. So we will further continue between Brin and then the. Sorry, I have to inform you again that the Ministry of Forestry and Environment now divided into two. Yeah, it's the new nomenclature under the new government. So it's separate again, the Ministry of Forestry and then the Ministry of Environment. Yeah. this is back to the previous nomenclature. So I think they are now still confused whether this project will be going under the Ministry of Forestry or under the Ministry of Environment. It's depend on how big is the issue, going towards the environment or going toward the forestry sector. I think that's the update, yeah, from us now. And thank you very much, Arnie, again. And then applause for Annie. And then hope that we can have another seminar, webinar, and then we can invite you again to share the knowledge. Again, thank you very much and have a good day. And thank you as well for all participants who still faithful sitting here, Pak Hairil Anwar, and then everyone else. Thank you for the question. And I'm not sure whether there is a gift, yeah, because last time we have a gift to the best three question. I'm not sure.
Can I say something to Arnie?
Yeah. Okay. Say.
Arnie,
Okay.
I am enjoying your presentation and your lecture. But I am
thank you very
dying,
much.
and I am dying to say that Arnie is right in the right time in the right place. But weeds and invasive species is in the wrong time and in the wrong place. Thank you.
That's correct.
Well
That's
said.
correct.
Well said.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Arnie, again. And then now I hand it over again to Radisti, yeah, the Master of Ceremony. Radisti.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Arnie.
Thank you, Bu Titik. So, ladies and gentlemen, Bapak Ibu sekalian, we have finally reached our at the end of our agenda today. But before I close this event, I would just like to quickly summarize some of the important points raised throughout our session today. We know that invasive alien species not only impacts on biodiversity, but also pose a significant threat for human health and well-being. And much of these impacts are also exacerbated by the changing of our environment, and the severity of these impacts also increases for the people living in limited resources, such as in Africa and also in Indonesia. So these cross-cutting impacts of invasive alien species requires, as Arne said, urgent and a concerted effort of integrated management strategy that also involves participation from all stakeholders to control the effects and spread of these invasive alien species. And this could be from approaches such as raising awareness, prevention, early detection, and also efforts to mitigate. And finally, the impacts of invasive species are not unique or specific to a country. So hopefully this session has provided a platform for us to learn from the experience in Africa that has been shared by Dr. Witt. So on behalf of the committee, I would like to thank our honorable speaker, Dr. Arne Witt, for the insightful talk, and of course, Dr. Titik as well for her excellent sharing. And thank you as well to all participants who attended and actively participated in this event. So see you at our next event. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Thank you, Adis. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Arnie.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.